On the 8th of November, 1942, at 1 minute past midnight, the first keel played of anew. Liberty's ship was laid down at Kaiser Permanente Metals Shipyard No. 2 in Richmond, California. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, the finished hull slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. They christened her the SS Robert E. Perry. A week after the keel was laid, she was delivered to the Merchant Marine, fully fitted out. On the 22nd of November, she sailed out of Richmond for combat duty. She was the 47th Liberty ship built at that yard. Her construction time was a fraction of the industry average. She was built almost entirely by welding, instead of riveting from prefabricated steel sections, built at inland factories and railed in. The press called it a stunt. Henry Kaiser called it an incentive ship. The German engineers who read about her in wire reports filed in Hamburg, in Bremen, and in Danzig called it something else. They called it a method they would have to copy. 2.5 years later, on the evening of the 30th of April, 1945, the afternoon, Hitler shot himself in the bunker in Berlin. A German submarine slipped her lines at Bergen, Norway. Her name was U-2511. She was a Type XXI U-boat, the most advanced submarine ever built. Germany had commissioned 119 of them. She was the only one that ever sailed an operational war patrol. 4 days later, with the war ending, she returned to Bergen without firing a single torpedo. The other 118 Type 21s sat at their docks. They were not Seeorthi, the hull sections that the German shipyards had tried to copy from Kaiser's method, had not fit together when they arrived for final assembly. The weld defects were lethal. The boats could not be sent to sea. This is the story of why an American engine, built in Detroit, could be uncrated in a Normandy field in the summer of 1944 and dropped into the engine bay of any Sherman tank in about 4 hours. And it is the story of why German mechanics trying to do the same thing with a Panther tank, built in their own country, spent their days hand-fitting parts that should have been interchangeable. In the end, the war was not won by the better tank. It was won by the better part number. To understand what stunned German mechanics in 1944, you have to go back almost a century and a half. In 1798, a Connecticut inventor named Eli Whitney signed a contract with the United States War Department to deliver 10,000 muskets. He promised the parts of those muskets would be interchangeable. A lock from one weapon would fit into any other weapon without filing or hand-fitting. In January of 1801, he gave a famous demonstration in front of President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson. He laid out the parts of 10 muskets on a table. He had Jefferson assemble a working firearm from pieces picked at random. It worked. It was also a fraud. The historian Merritt Rose Smith in his book Harper's Ferry Armory, and the new technology proved that Whitney had pre-selected those parts. He had hand-fitted them in his Connecticut workshop and labeled them for the demonstration. Smith concluded that Whitney purposely duped government authorities. The real breakthrough came somewhere else, and it came slowly. It came at the Federal Armories of Springfield, Massachusetts, and Harper's Ferry, Virginia. At Harper's Ferry, a gunsmith named John H. Hall, working under contract to the Ordnance Department, spent 20 years developing manufacturing methods that produced parts to such tight tolerances that the parts actually were interchangeable. The historian David Hounsell, in his book From the American System to Mass Production, calls Hall's 1819 breech loading rifle the first product ever made in large numbers whose components could be freely exchanged with one another and still function. It had taken 20 years to reach that point. 20 years of jigs and fixtures, custom-built milling machines, and hardened steel gauges that an inspector could clamp onto a finished part to judge it in a single second. 20 years of rejecting parts that did not pass and dropping suppliers that delivered too many rejects. By the time the British held their Great Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851, American gun makers were exhibiting revolvers from Samuel Colt of Hartford and rifles from Robbins and Lawrence of Windsor, Vermont. The British were stunned. They coined a phrase for what they were looking at. They called it the American System of Manufacturers. Britain formed a committee, sent it across the Atlantic to Springfield in 1853, and placed orders for American machine tools to re-equip its own Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. The technology that had begun in Connecticut and matured in West Virginia crossed back to Europe, but Europe never fully adopted it. European industry and German industry above all kept its old culture. It kept what the Germans called the Facharbeiter, the skilled craftsman, at the heart of every workshop. A part on a German lathe in 1905 was finished by a man with a micrometer and a file. He took pride in making it fit. The American part was finished by a gauge. When the Second World War began, that difference would decide the war. In May of 1940, German tanks rolled into France. Within 6 weeks, the French army had surrendered and the British were evacuating from Dunkirk. President Franklin Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office and asked one question: who in this country could actually build the weapons America was going to need? The financier Bernard Baruch gave him the answer in 3 words. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. William Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who had arrived in New York Harbor in 1900. At the age of 20, he had risen through the Ford Motor Company under Henry Ford himself, organizing the assembly lines at Highland Park that produced the Model T. He had moved to General Motors and become its president by 1937. He understood industrial production at a depth almost no other man alive understood it. Roosevelt offered him the job of running American war production. Knudsen accepted. He gave up a salary north of $300,000 a year as president of General Motors and accepted a federal salary of $1. Knudsen had a manufacturing creed. He stated it constantly. Speed produces nothing in manufacturing. He said accuracy is the only straight line to greater production. At the plants he had run, he was famous for confiscating hammers and files. If a part did not pass the gauge, it was thrown out. It was not adjusted, not tapped, not filed to fit. It was discarded and the supplier was put on notice. Starting in 1940, Knudsen pushed that principle into every contract, every plant, and every supplier in the United States that wanted to build weapons. He needed tanks. The United States Army in 1940 had fewer than 400 tanks, almost all of them obsolete. He went looking for someone who could build modern medium tanks in volume. He went to K.T. Keller, the president of Chrysler. Keller agreed. Knudsen called Albert Kahn, the architect who had designed the Ford Rouge complex and the Highland Park plant. Kahn drew up plans for a tank factory on 113 acres of farmland in Warren Township, Michigan, just outside Detroit. Ground was broken in September of 1940. The first M3 Lee tank rolled off the assembly line on the 24th of April, 1941. The roof was not yet finished. They called it the Detroit Tank Arsenal. It was 5 city blocks long and 2 city blocks wide. It held 1,000 machine tools and 8,000 specialized jigs. In December of 1942, it produced 97 Sherman tanks in a single month. By the end of the war, Chrysler had built $25,059 tanks at that one facility and had refunded approximately $50 million to the United States Treasury for coming in under cost. Across the country, 10 other factories joined Chrysler in building Shermans. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Gros Blanc, Michigan, run by General Motors, built 11,358. Pressed steel car in Illinois, built 8,147. Pullman's Standard in Pennsylvania, built 3,426. American Locomotive in Schenectady, New York. Ford Motor Company at Highland Park. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. Baldwin Locomotive in Philadelphia. Pacific Car and Foundry in Bellevue, Washington. Federal Machine and Welder in Warren, Ohio. Montreal Locomotive Works in Canada. 11 plants. Between them, by the time the war ended, they had produced almost 50,000 Sherman medium tanks. The exact figure from R.P. Hunat's standard reference, the book titled simply Sherman, is 49,234. Here is the part that mattered. A tank built at the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan. and a tank built at Pacific Car and Foundry in Bellevue, Washington, 3,000 miles away on the other side of the continent. Used parts that interchanged. Bolt patterns matched, mounting brackets fit. Shaft splines aligned, the transmission unbolted and slid out as a single unit. The engine bay accepted any of 4 entirely different power plants designed and built by 4 entirely different manufacturers. Inside the Sherman family, 4 engines, 4 companies, all fitting the same hull. That had never been done before. The first engine was the Continental R975, a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial that had started life in 1928 as an aircraft engine, the Wright J6 Whirlwind. It produced 400 horsepower at 2,400 revolutions per minute. Continental motors built over 53,000 of them for armored vehicles at its East Jefferson Avenue plant in Detroit and at its plant in Muskegon, Michigan. Roughly 7 times as many for tanks as Wright had ever built for airplanes. The Sherman installation added a power shaft-driven cooling fan and shroud to replace the airflow that a propeller would normally have provided on an airplane. The engine went into the M4 and the M4A1 Sherman variants. The second engine was the General Motors 6046 twin diesel. This was a pair of Detroit diesel 6 to 71 inline 6-cylinder, 2-stroke diesel engines yoked to a common output shaft, each keeping its own crankshaft, so that either could run independently if the other failed. Total displacement was 850 cub-in. Output was 410 gross horsepower. Total weight just over 5,000 pounds. It went into the M4A2 Sherman. Almost 11,000 of those were built. The Marine Corps preferred them because diesel fuel did not burn as readily as gasoline when a tank was hit. The Red Army received almost 5,000 of them through Lend-Lease. A Soviet after-action report from the 5th Guards Tank Brigade, dated the 23rd of October, 1943, stated that compared to the T-34, the M4A2 was easier to control and more durable in long marches because the engines did not require frequent adjustments. The tanks, the report said, performed well in combat. The third engine is the one that more than any other showed what American industry could actually do. The Chrysler A57 Multibank. In 1942, the Army needed more tank engines than Continental or General Motors could build. Chrysler was asked to design one in a hurry. There was no time to draw up a power plant from scratch. So, 2 Chrysler engineers, Harry Wilson and Mel Carpenter, took 5 Chrysler car engines, ordinary 250.6, 6 cubic in inline 6-cylinder. I had engines off the Plymouth assembly line and clustered them around a central crankcase. The 5 engines drove a single common output shaft through helical gears. Total displacement 1253 cub in total. Cylinder count 30. Carburetors 5 distributors. 5 water pumps. 1. Total horsepower 425. 5 car engines bolted to a single shaft. The most surprising thing about it is that it worked beautifully. The A57 Multibank turned out to be the most reliable tank engine of the entire Sherman family. Abedyne proving ground data from 1944 showed that crews running the Multibank Sherman spent just 45 hours on engine maintenance during the test period. The figures for the other engines were 110 hours for the M4A3 with the Ford engine, 132 for the M4A1 with the Continental, and 143 for the M4A2 with the twin diesel. British crews running the Multibank reported a mean distance between major overhauls of 4,000 kilometers. Chrysler built 9,965 of these engines between April 1942 and September 1943. Almost all of them went to the British, who used the multi-bank Sherman as the basis for the Sherman Firefly, the only Allied tank in the West with a gun powerful enough to reliably penetrate the front armor of a German Tiger or Panther. The 4th engine was the Ford GAA V8, and its origin story is one of the strangest engineering accidents of the war. In 1940, Ford had been developing a V-12 aircraft engine, hoping to win a contract with the United States Army Air Corps. The contract never came. The Air Corps was committed to the Allison V1710. So, Ford had a fully designed all-aluminum V12 with dual overhead camshafts and a 60 degrees bank angle sitting in its engineering department with nowhere to go. The Army Ordnance Department asked Ford if it could be turned into a tank engine. Ford's engineers LP'd 4 cylinders off the castings. They kept the 60 degrees bank, the all-aluminum block, the dual overhead camshafts, the gear-driven accessories. The result was the Ford GAAA, an 18L all-aluminum V8 with dual overhead camshafts producing 500 gross horsepower at 2,600 revolutions per minute. The engineering specification, in other words, of a modern Formula One engine, and Ford was building it at its Lincoln plant in Detroit in 1942 for installation, in tanks driven through mud and snow. Approximately 28,000 were produced. They powered the M4A3 Sherman, including the EZ-8, the jumbo assault tank, and ultimately the M26 Persing heavy tank. 4 entirely different engines, 3 engine companies, and 1 tank arsenal that built them, 11 assembly plants that received them, and whichever engine was pulled, whichever Sherman variant it was bolted into, it fit. The bell housing matched the transmission input shaft. The mounting brackets matched the engine bay rails. The cooling shrouds bolted up. The bolt patterns lined up. The hoses connected. The wiring harnesses plugged in. The parts dropped right in. In the orchards and sunken farm lanes of Normandy in the summer of 1944, the United States Army applied that principle in the field. The result captured in an armored force reliability study quoted in Hunut's Sherman came from the mouth of an anonymous American tanker. He said it was an easy matter to change an engine, that it took little more than 4 hours, and that it beat all hollow the best time for the Germans. How did one army do this when the other could not? The answer was in the system of organized maintenance the United States had built before the war ever started. Army maintenance was structured around 5 echelons. First echelon was the tank crew themselves doing daily checks and lubrication. Second echelon was the unit mechanics doing minor repairs in the field. Third echelon was the divisional ordnance company doing medium repairs in mobile shops set up under trees. Fourth echelon was the heavy maintenance battalion at field army level doing complete engine and transmission swaps, hull welding, gun replacement. Fifth echelon was depot rebuild back in England, in Italy, all the way back at arsenals in the United States. In Europe, the system answered to Major General Henry B. Saylor, Chief Ordnance Officer of the European Theatre of Operations. Saylor in turn answered to the Chief of Ordnance in Washington, Major General Levin Hicks Campbell. Junior Campbell had taken over the entire Ordnance Department in June of 1942. His first general order on assuming office stated plainly that whenever a member of the Ordnance Department